Deep in the hills of New Zealand's North Island, tourists walk quietly between grass-covered mounds. Some don't realize they're standing on top of a village. Roofs, doorways, entire homes, all buried beneath the earth. For decades, almost no one outside the region knew this place existed. Locals simply called it the Buried Village. But before it disappeared, this was a thriving Maori settlement, a place of daily life, trade, and tradition. A place tourists once traveled across the world to see. Then, in a single night, everything changed. The ground shook, the sky turned black, and a village that had stood for generations vanished beneath ash and mud. What remained wasn't destroyed by war. It wasn't lost to time. It was buried alive by nature itself. Today, archaeologists are still uncovering what that night left behind. And the story of this village reveals something remarkable about how quickly history can disappear, and how carefully it can be found again. This is the story of the village nobody knew about. Long before the ash fell, this land looked completely different. Rolling hills, thermal springs, steam rising from the earth like breath. The Maori who settled here called it Tiwaroa. They chose this place for a reason. Nearby stood something extraordinary: the pink and white terraces, cascading pools of mineral rock, shaped by geothermal water over thousands of years. Some travelers of the time called them the eighth wonder of the world. By the 1800s, word had spread far beyond New Zealand. European visitors began arriving by the boatload. Tiwaroa transformed almost overnight. Guest houses appeared. Guides were hired. A quiet village became a gateway to something the world had never seen. For the people living there, life took on a new rhythm. Trade increased. Money flowed in. Maori guides led foreigners across the land their ancestors had walked for generations. It seemed, for a moment, like a golden age. But nearby, something had been stirring for weeks. Locals began noticing changes in the land. Strange tremors, shifts in the water, small warnings most people didn't understand. Some elders grew uneasy. Others dismissed it as nothing unusual. No one could have known how little time was left, because just beyond the terraces, a mountain that had stood silent for centuries was about to wake up. And when it did, it wouldn't just threaten the village. It would erase it from the map entirely. On the morning of June 10, 1886, the air felt different. Heavier, tense, charged with something no one could name. Just after midnight, the ground beneath Tiwaroa began to shake. Not a gentle tremor, a deep, rolling force that rattled homes and woke entire families. Then came the sound. Witnesses would later describe it as thunder that never stopped. Mount Tarawera had split open. 3 massive craters tore across its summit, hurling rock, ash, and fire into the night sky. For a moment, the darkness turned into daylight. Ash fell so thick that roofs began to groan under the weight. Families huddled together, unsure whether to run or shelter in place. One decision would determine who survived the night. Meanwhile, something extraordinary was happening beneath their feet. Lake Rotomahana, sitting near the volcano, was being torn apart by the eruption. Steam explosions ripped through the lake bed, hurling boulders and scalding mud for miles. The very ground the villagers depended on was being reshaped in real time. By the time the sun rose, Tiwaroa would look nothing like it had the day before. But the true scale of what had happened wasn't yet clear, and what searches would find in the wreckage would change how the world understood the disaster. Fields, pathways, entire landmarks had simply disappeared. Survivors emerged into a landscape that no longer matched their memory of home. Some families had escaped in time. Others had not been so fortunate. One of the strongest structures in the village was a large meeting house, built using traditional Maori construction. Its sturdy design allowed dozens of people to shelter inside as the roof strained under falling ash. That single building would later be credited with saving many lives. But beyond its walls, the scene was devastating. Homes had been crushed, livestock lost, entire households buried where they stood. Rescue efforts began almost immediately, though communication with the outside world was slow. News of the eruption took time to reach nearby towns. When help finally arrived, rescuers were stunned by what they found. Some structures were completely intact beneath the ash, preserved almost perfectly, like a moment frozen in time. Others had vanished entirely, swallowed by mud and debris. The famous pink and white terraces, the reason travelers had once flocked to this region, were gone, destroyed or buried beneath the transformed landscape. A place once celebrated as a wonder of the natural world had ceased to exist in a single night. For the survivors, grief mixed with disbelief. Their home, their livelihood, their history, reshaped in hours. But even as the village lay buried, something unexpected was happening. The land itself was quietly preserving what the disaster had destroyed. And decades later, that preservation would lead to a discovery no one had anticipated. For years after the eruption, Tiwaroa remained untouched. The land had buried its own history, and few people saw a reason to disturb it. But by the early 20th century, curiosity began to return. Descendants of survivors still remembered stories passed down from that night. Local families spoke of homes still standing beneath the ash, waiting exactly as they'd been left. Eventually, that curiosity turned into action. In the 1930s, small excavation efforts began. What researchers uncovered was unlike anything they expected. Beneath layers of hardened ash, entire buildings had survived almost fully intact. Wooden support beams, storage pits, everyday tools left exactly where they had been used. It wasn't a ruin. It was a moment paused in time. As digging continued, more of the village came into view. Pathways once used daily by villagers, the outline of homes that had sheltered families during the eruption, even personal items, untouched for decades, resting exactly where they'd been dropped. For archaeologists, this wasn't just an excavation. It was a direct window into a single night in 1886. But one discovery stood apart from the rest. Deep within the buried remains, researchers found something that raised new questions about how the villagers had lived just before disaster struck. Something that hinted this was not simply a farming settlement, but a community deeply shaped by trade, tourism, and cultural exchange. The buried village, it turned out, held more layers of history than anyone initially realized. And what came next would connect this quiet corner of New Zealand to the wider story of the modern world. Among the recovered artifacts, researchers found imported goods, pieces of pottery, glass, and tools that had no origin in New Zealand at all. Evidence that this small village had been connected to a much larger world. Guides who once led tourists to the pink and white terraces had built relationships far beyond their own borders. Photographs, letters, and travel accounts from visitors began surfacing in archives overseas. Suddenly, Tiwaroa wasn't just a footnote in New Zealand's history. It was part of a global story, one tied to exploration, tourism, and cultural exchange in the late 1800s. But amid the excitement, a difficult truth emerged. Not everyone in the village had been given the same voice in the story that followed. Written records from the era were shaped mostly by European visitors. Maori perspectives, oral histories, and first-hand memory were harder to trace, scattered across generations rather than official archives. It would mean listening closely to descendants who still carried these stories today. As excavation continued, another mystery surfaced. Certain areas of the site showed signs of activity that didn't match everyday village life. Structures positioned differently, objects grouped in unusual ways. Something about this section of Tiwaroa suggested more than survival. It suggested preparation, as if, in the final hours before disaster, some in the village somehow sensed what was coming. And what researchers found next would raise a question that still lingers over this buried village today. Oral histories passed down by Maori elders offered an answer researchers hadn't fully expected. Some accounts spoke of warnings in the days before the eruption, sightings interpreted as omens, unusual behavior in the local wildlife, a sense among certain elders that something was wrong. Whether these signs were understood as symbolic or literal, they shaped how some villagers responded that night. Not everyone dismissed the tremors as ordinary. For historians, this detail matters. It shows a community whose experience wasn't just recorded in ash and rubble, but carried forward through memory, culture, and voice. Today, Tiwaroa is no longer forgotten. The buried village has become a preserved historical site, welcoming visitors who walk the same paths guides once used more than a century ago. Excavated foundations remain visible. Recovered artifacts sit protected. Descendants of survivors still share their family's connection to that night. The pink and white terraces, long thought lost forever, have even become the subject of renewed scientific interest, with modern surveys suggesting remnants may still exist beneath the lake. What began as a single, devastating night in 1886 continues to shape research, memory, and identity today. Tiwaroa stands as a reminder of how quickly a thriving community can disappear, and how, even after disaster, history finds a way to resurface, not through myth, not through speculation, but through soil, memory, and the quiet persistence of truth. This was the village nobody knew about. Now, its story is finally being told. If you enjoyed uncovering this piece of history, if stories like this fascinate you, there's more history waiting to be explored. Subscribe and join us for the next journey into the past.